Chapter 5 of David and the Phoenix. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Weeks. David and the Phoenix by Edward Ormondroyd. Chapter 5, in which the scientist arrives in pursuit of the Phoenix, and there are alarums and excursions by night. The lights downstairs were all on when David got home, and as soon as he opened the front door he could tell that they had company. He shouted, "I'm home!" and sneezed. The dust from the Griffin's cave still clung to him, tickling his nose. "Well, here he is at last," said Dad's voice. "Come on in, David." Then as David walked into the living room, "Good heavens, son, what's happened to you?" "Your back, David," Mother said in a horrified voice. "Your poor back. What happened to you?" David felt himself. The back of his shirt was ripped to tatters, and there were 3 lines of caked blood across his shoulders. He remembered now. It was the Griffin that had tried to grab him as he and the Phoenix made their escape. But he had promised the Phoenix to keep it secret. He stammered, I had an accident." "And dust all over you," Mother went on. "Well," said David desperately, "it was a dusty accident." "It seems to have been very dusty indeed," said a third voice. There was a loud sneeze. David's father jumped up. "You gave me such a shock when you came in that I almost forgot, David. We have a guest." And he introduced David to a very tall, thin man with a bald head. His face and neck were burnt red by the sun, and he had on a pair of thick glasses which made his pale eyes look immense. For some reason David took an instant dislike to him, but he shook hands politely and said, "How do you do?" "David, said the man. "Well, well. Are you a good boy, David?" Of all the stupid questions in the world, that was the one David hated most. He clenched his teeth and looked the other way. "David, dear," said Mother with an awkward laugh, "I think you'd better go upstairs and wash and change." When David came into the living room again, the guest was talking excitedly. "Completely unknown to man," he was saying. "It's the discovery of the age. My name will be famous if I succeed in my plans." "How fascinating," Mother said. "And to think of it happening right here." "And it's huge," the guest said. "Simply huge, and brilliantly colored. For a scientist like myself, it's more than fascinating." David was listening now. Scientist? Scientist? His heart missed a beat, and he choked. Oh no, it couldn't be the scientist, or could it? "David here spends all his time up on the mountain," his father said. "Maybe he's seen it." The guest turned his big, pale, unpleasant eyes on David. "Well, David," he said, "maybe you can help me. Now, have you seen anything unusual on the mountain?" "Unusual?" said David unsteadily. There was a pain in his chest from the pounding of his heart. "Yes, David," the guest went on, "unusual. So unusual that you couldn't miss it. A very large bird with bright plumage." The floor under David seemed to rock. It was true, then. It was horribly true. This was the scientist who had been chasing the Phoenix. This was their enemy. "Bird?" David dodged. Why, there are lots of birds up there. Sparrows and meadowlarks and sparrows. But nothing like a huge bird with bright feathers? Well, he would have to tell a lie. After all, it was for the Phoenix's sake. "No," said David. "Ah," said the scientist, but his cold eyes bored into David's for another instant, plainly saying, "I'm not fooled, young man." "It's odd," he continued, "that no one has seen it. But I have no doubt it's somewhere here. I am going to begin my search as soon as my equipment gets here." "Tell us about it," said Mother politely. "Well, I discovered it on the other side of the valley, you know," said the scientist eagerly. "Quite by accident. I was really looking for another species. Now, birds, you know, have fixed habits. If you know those habits, you can predict just what they will do at any time. This particular bird was a daytime creature, so I tried to watch it between dawn and dusk. But it seemed to have a mind of its own. You might almost say an intelligence. It avoided me in a very clever way, and it avoided my traps also. Uncanny. So after several weeks I decided to shoot it if I got the chance. Then suddenly it disappeared. But I'm certain it came over to this side of the valley." There was no escape from the subject during dinner. The scientist could think and talk of nothing else. He described the merits of deadfalls, snares, steel traps, and birdlime. He asked which they thought would make the best bait, a rabbit, a beefsteak, a live lamb, or carrion. He told them all about the new high-powered long-range rifle which he had ordered, and he vowed to them all that he would not rest until the bird was either caught or killed, for the advancement of human learning. David listened with horror. The dinner before him went untouched. His only thought was that now he would have to warn the Phoenix as soon as possible. The Phoenix would go to South America after all, and his education would end before it had even started. All because of this hateful man. He fought to hold back his tears. Dinner was over at last. David mumbled his excuses and ducked out of the dining room, but Aunt Amy seized him firmly just as he thought he had got away. "Bedtime for you, David," she said firmly. "Oh, Aunt Amy, please, I've got to. Upstairs, young man. You've had enough gallivanting around for one day. You're all worn out." "I'm not," said David, struggling. "I feel fine. Look, I just have to." It was useless. She marched him upstairs to his room and stood in the doorway until he had undressed and put on his pajamas and got into bed. "Now," she said, "you go to sleep. The mountain will still be there in the morning, unless there's a landslide. Good night." And she turned out the light and shut the door. This was awful. He could not sneak downstairs, because the stairs could be seen from the living room. He could not climb out of his window, because a rose arbor was directly beneath it, and he would be ripped by the thorns. And Mother always came in to say good night before she went to bed. If he was not there when she came in tonight, there would be a lot of unpleasant explaining to do. The only thing, then, was to wait until the scientist went home and everyone was in bed. It was a maddening wait. The scientist's voice went on and on like the drone of an electric fan, interrupted only by an occasional murmur from Mother or Dad. For a while David sat in bed, twisting the sheets in his hands. Then he got up and paced the room in his bare feet. It seemed to him that 3 or 4 whole night times had passed before he finally heard all 3 voices raised and talking at once. The scientist was going. Now they were saying goodbye at the front door. Now the door was being closed. Now there were footsteps on the stairs. He jumped into bed just before Mother put her head in and said, "Good night, dear." David murmured, pretending to be half asleep. His door closed again. The light switches snapped, and there was silence. He waited another half-hour to make sure everyone was asleep. As quickly and silently as he could, he pulled on his clothes, crept out of his room, and slid cautiously down the banister. In the backyard he put on his shoes, dived through the hedge, and started to race up the mountainside. Fortunately there was a nearly full moon and no clouds in the sky. But even with this light it was not easy to keep to the trail. Several times he lost his way, so that the trip took much longer than usual. But he found the ledge at last, climbed over the final difficult rock, and sat down to catch his breath. When he could speak, he called softly, "Phoenix!" There was no answer. "Phoenix!" He pushed through the thicket to the other side of the ledge. "Phoenix!" The Phoenix was gone. The tears that had been stopped up all evening could be held no longer. David dropped to the ground, leaned his forehead against a rock, and let them go. He had just remembered. As soon as they had come back from the Griffin adventure, the Phoenix had flown off on some sort of business, and it had not said when it would return. The tears cleared David's mind and made him feel better. Now what? He began to think. If he stayed on the ledge all night, they might find out at home and make a terrible fuss. But if he did not warn the Phoenix before morning, the scientist might creep up while the bird was resting and trap it or shoot it. So he would have to warn the Phoenix and return home. And the only way to do both these things was to write the Phoenix a note. But he had neither paper nor pencil. A fine mess he had made of everything. Now he would have to go all the way back home, write the note, come all the way back up to the ledge, and then go home again. David trudged down the mountainside in a very low mood. Now that he had a definite plan to work on, his fear was gone, but he felt that he had been pretty stupid to rush off without thinking of everything first. In his mind he could hear the Phoenix saying, "Look before you leap, my boy," and other wise words of advice.